What is a spell? It's a discrete magical effect. A character carefully plucks at the invisible strands of raw magic. Yeah, interesting flavoring, but not all too helpful. So you kind of have two different categories of spells. You have cantrips and you have your leveled spells, which are level 1 to 9. Player's Handbook really just says it spells 0 to 9, but I like to separate the two of them because you can't cast two leveled spells in a turn, or really you can't use two spell slots in a turn. So what is a cantrip? It's kind of like your basic attack is a wizard or a spellcaster. It doesn't take any resources, so it doesn't take any energy or mana, or for D&D, their equivalent is spell slots. Cantrips also work a little bit differently because they get stronger as the spellcaster levels up. So for example, you can cast Firebolt for 1d10 damage, or you can use a first level spell and cast Chromatic Orb for 3d8 damage. Obviously, Chromatic Orb is better and would do more damage, but it does take that resource that we'll talk about in a little bit. Where it gets weird though is if you're a level 17 wizard, Chromatic Orb still does 3d8 damage if you're casting that first level spell. Firebolt would do 4d10 damage, and so Firebolt at that point does more damage. So that's where cantrips are, again, a little bit different, is they will often get stronger as you level up. I would encourage, though, not to take just solely combat cantrips. There are a couple fun ones that you should take, like at least Thaumaturgy or Prestidigitation. They can add some cool role-playing moments, and you can kind of do that like Gandalf thing. I'm not trying to rob you and make the lights dim as someone's intimidating someone, and maybe even getting advantage on your intimidation check. So now moving on to leveled spells. Again, level 1 to level 9. A little bit confusing here because you might think at level 9 you can cast 9th level spells. Wrong, you can only cast 9th level spells once you get to level 17. I'll use wizards as an example for a full spellcaster. So using wizards as an example, here's where they learn each of the different leveled spells. At 3rd level, you learn 2nd level spells. At 5th level, you will learn your 3rd level spells. Now that number that you're seeing in there is the amount of spell slots you have. Spell slots, as I said before, is their version of like energy or mana. So at 1st level, that means you can cast 2 spells as a wizard. This is pretty standard, though different classes will get different amounts of spell slots. Warlocks, for example, don't get nearly as many spell slots. And then you have half casters. So here's an example of paladins. Not only do they not get as many spell slots, but they also don't learn as powerful of spells. They cap out at 5th level spells. And so that's what we would consider a half caster. But getting back to looking at wizards as our example and spell slots, something interesting about the way spell slots work is you can actually upcast spells. If we go back to our earlier example with that Chromatic Orb, at the bottom you see at higher levels when you cast the spell using a spell slot of 2nd level or higher, the damage increases by 1d8 for each spell slot above 1st level. So if you cast that using a 2nd level spell slot, it would then do 48. Even if it doesn't have that at higher level section, all spells can be cast at a higher level. So if you run out of 1st level spell slots and you want to cast Shield, you can cast it using a 2nd level spell slot. But note, you cannot downcast. So if you want to cast Fireball, which takes a 3rd level spell slot, you cannot cast it with a 2nd level spell slot. That is the minimum requirements. It takes at least a 3rd level spell slot. Most classes refresh their spell slots on a long rest, but there are some classes like the Warlock that refreshes their spell slots on a short rest. So let's get more into the casting of these spells. In order to cast a spell, you not only have to know the spell, but you also have to have the spell prepared. That's kind of their default rule, but there's certain classes like sorcerers and bards that every spell they know is always prepared. And then there's more of like the classic, like the wizard has a spell book and they can add as many spells as they can find into that spell book. There's not really a cap to the amount of known spells they can have, but there is a cap to how many spells they have prepared. Your prepared spells are basically your hotkeys, what you have ready to go. The number of prepared spells you can have for a wizard at least is your level plus your intelligence modifier. For some of the other classes like cleric, I think it's the same, but uses your wisdom modifier. For certain classes, they'll have a limited number of spells that they can know, and they're just always prepared. And then for other classes, if there's not a limit to the amount of spells they can know, you have to go through the preparation or the preparing spell process. But just whenever you finish a rest, you just have to make sure you have listed which spells are prepared. There's also ritual spells. If it has a ritual tag and your class can perform ritual spells, all that means is you can take 10 minutes to cast it without using a spell slot and I don't believe you even have to have it on your prepared list. You have a spell, you know it, you have it prepared. What is the process for actually casting the spell? So the first thing you need to worry about is the casting time. This could be a reaction, a bonus action, or an action. You can't cast 2 leveled spells in a turn, or really you can't use 2 spell slots in a turn. What that means is if you cast something like Misty Step is a bonus action, you cannot then follow that up with a Fireball because that would be 2 leveled spells in one turn. But what you could do is instead of Fireball, you could cast Firebolt because that's just a cantrip. And some of them are even longer than an action where they take a minute, 10 minutes, hour, etc. to cast the spell. A note on some of the longer casting time, you have to concentrate on the spell during the entire process of casting the spell, which means you can't concentrate on another spell while doing that. We'll talk about concentration in a minute. All spells should also list the range, though the range of some might be touch. And there's things to note in each of the spell. For example, do you need to see the target? Because if you're in a darkness spell and you need to be able to see the target, then you can't hit them with that spell, even if they're within range. So that's another thing to notice is the range and whether or not you need to be able to see the target. The next thing that you need to worry about, or at least look at, are the components. This will be denoted under the component section with V, S, and M. V stands for verbal. This is you need to say something, which means if a spell has a verbal component, you cannot cast a spell if you're under the effects of a silent spell because you can't talk, or if you're gagged or they cut out your tongue, anything like that, then you would not be able to cast a spell with a verbal component. The next is somatic, which means you need to be able to do hand gestures, and you need at least 1 free hand. Again, won't be able to cast spells if you're holding something with 2 hands. Something to note if you're a dungeon master, if spellcasters are decently common in your world, most NPCs would know how to stop spellcasters from casting them. They would be aware of the components, and they would be aware if we gag a wizard, then he can't say stuff and can't cast his spells, or if we tie his hands up or cut them off, then he can't cast spells. So something to be aware of. The materials required to cast the spell. Something to note though is if you have a component pouch or an arcane focus, you can ignore the material portion. I shouldn't say ignore it, but you can use that instead of the material component, except for if there is a cost associated to the material component. So going back to that Chromatic Orb example, it says in order to cast it, you need a diamond worth at least 50 gold pieces, which means you need that diamond. Your arcane focus will not substitute that. But it also means all you need is that diamond. You don't need your arcane focus if you're holding that diamond. And some spells will consume the material when you cast it. This is pretty common if for any revival or resurrection spell, you need a diamond worth at least 1,000 gold pieces, which are consumed when you cast it. So that does happen. All right, we talked a little bit before about concentration. There are certain spells that have a C tag on it or concentration. It'll look like this. Here's an example spell that takes concentration. It basically means the spell continues to persist while you are able to concentrate on it. But there are some things that can break your concentration. This is to any time you take damage, you need to make a Constitution saving throw, which is like a concentration check. It's just a Constitution saving throw. The base DC for a concentration check is 10. So if this is anything like you get hit with any sort of small attack, then the DC is 10. Or it could be half of the damage that they take, whichever is greater. So if you take 30 damage, the DC is then a 15. But it's not just damage that can require a concentration check. If you fall over, if some spell like knocks you prone, the DM could require you to make a concentration check for that. And most of the time the DC for any of those sorts of things would just be 10. If you cast any other spell that requires concentration, you will immediately lose concentration on your previous spell. And this includes casting any sort of spell that has a long casting time that you'll need to concentrate on during the casting process. And of course, if you're knocked unconscious or killed, anything like that, concentration instantly broken. Here's also a table of the different schools of magic. I'm not going to go through each of it. You can read it on your own, but it is something that's good to be aware of. If you still have any questions on casting spells in D&D 5e or in the magic system, I'm going to be doing another advanced video on magic shortly, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss that one. Thanks.